Good morning. Well, actually, it's 5 after 12, so it's officially good afternoon, and welcome to Luncheon with Books. I want to first of all thank our help today, Ron and Shirley and Brenda. Let's give them a hand from helping out with the food and what have you. Also, if you're not a member of Friends of the Lee County Library, they are membership cards on your table, so feel free to fill one of those out and get it back to us, either me or fill it back there. Also, in terms of announcements, on Thursday, May 9th at 6 p.m., the Lee County Library will welcome Dr. Catherine Sharp Landeck to Tupelo as the speaker of the 2024 Helen Foster Lecture. Dr. Landeck's professor of history at Texas Women's University, is a Normandy scholar, a Guggenheim Fellow at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, and author of The Women with Silver Wings, an inspiring story that I think y'all are all enjoying. Again, that's May 9th at 6 p.m. That's on a Thursday evening. Coming up in May, yours truly will be presenting at Lunching with Books, Playing for Overtime, the David Lee Herbert story by Al Ainsworth and forwarded by Rick Cleveland. It's a book kind of about football, but it's so much more than that. I was going to wait till the fall and do this, but just quickly a short synopsis. In the fall of 1998, when Tishomingo High School head football coach called one of the gutsiest, cleverest, and most memorable plays ever conceived in the history of football. Later that week, CBS sportscaster Brent Musburger discussed the play on NFL Today pregame show. Paul Harvey told the story on his radio show, The Rest of the Story. And more importantly, Playing for Overtime is an inspirational story of a Mississippi football coach whose perseverance and faith when life, even God, seemed to be piling on. It continues to set a standard for responding to life's most difficult circumstances, and I hope y'all be here to enjoy that. Coming up in June 26th, we have political cartoonist and journalist Marshall Ramsey. So y'all try to make a point to be here for that. At this point, I don't know if he's going to need overhead or audio, or if he's just going to talk, but anyway, it should be interesting. And that brings us to today's author. Jo Edd Morris was born in New Albany, Mississippi. His education includes a degree in philosophy from Millsaps, a master's of theology, and Candler School of Theology, Emory University, a degree in psychology. That was his PhD he took from the University of Mississippi, plus doctoral work in theology at Emory University. In addition to his writing career, Jo Edd Morris is a licensed psychologist and a jury consultant. That's kind of interesting. We may have to have him come back and talk about that a little bit. That should be interesting. He has maintained a private practice for the past 30 years, taught at several universities and community college, served as a consultant to major corporations, and enjoyed the lecture workshop circuit around the U.S. Prior to these opportunities, he was a United Methodist minister, serving churches in Mississippi, Georgia, Scotland, Colorado, Washington, D.C., plus 1 year above the Arctic Circle as chaplain for the DEW Line. And I had to look that up, Jo Edd, Dr. Morris. DEW Line, D-E-W is the acronym, and that stands for Distance Early Warning System, which I think began in the 50s during the Cold War, and it was a radar system, and he was up there living in and amongst the people who were making that happen. And that kind of ties in with Mr. Shackelford's talk last week, where he talked about the Air Force security system, which I think there's a connect there. In addition, he and his wife Sandy currently divide time between homes in Tupelo, Mississippi, and Lake Junaluska in North Carolina. They have 3 grown children, Meredith, Anna Catherine, and Jason. So let's welcome Dr. John Edd Morris.
Harold, thank you. And it's always, as you become an octogenarian, it's always nice to be reminded of who you are. Last time I was here, I talked about some celebrities that were in our midst, and one of them was not there then, but she's here today. She is the most prolific writer in Mississippi history. And she also has the distinction of over 40 years of writing, and she's got a bunch of new stuff coming out. Y'all need to have her here some Wednesday at lunch. But she's written for 4 of the top 5 publishing companies, including Random House, Simon & Schuster, HarperCollins, and another one I just became aware of, Hachette. It's an international firm, big firm. Anyway, kudos, Peggy. You know. I've never done a tetralogy before. I had to look it up to see what it meant and how to spell it. I was unsure where to begin with this, and I thought about talking about starting out with where writers get their ideas for books. A guy named Faulkner saw 3 children climbing a tree in the house next to him to look in on a wake that was taking place in that home. I knew those 3 kids. They were friends of mine. I grew up with them because my mama's best friend was Kate Baker. Her husband was Colonel William Baker, who was the mayor of Oxford at one time, and their house was right next door to Roanoke. And when Faulkner saw that image, a seed was dropped in his mind, a pregnancy ensued, and a book was born. And the title of that book was The Sound and the Fury, which I consider probably the greatest piece of American literature that's ever been written. If you probably know that the title was taken from a quote from Shakespeare, a tale of sound and fury told by an idiot. But you notice that Faulkner changed things a little bit. The title of his book is The Sound and the Fury. And you want to guess who the sound was in the novel, The Sound and the Fury? It was Dilsey the maid. And the fury was the Compson family whirling around her. So it's interesting how authors get certain ideas. Wordsworth was in a carriage one day traveling through England, and he saw an old man who was bent over, crippled, ambling with a cane, struggling. And he took out his notepad and started taking notes. And that became lines from Tennant Abbey, if any of you remember some of your sophomore lit. I remember, and I want to say this, there's a reason why I want to do this, but there's some lines in that poem where he saw that old crippled fellow, and he said, I am reminded in my youth of nature, not of the glory of nature, but of the harsh, grating sound of humanity. And he went on to write, I have felt a presence that inspires me, that is in the round sky and the blue ocean and the air and in the mind of man, a motion that moves through all things and all thought of all things and rolls through all things. Now, I butchered that quote, but I wanted to do that in memory of a great teacher who's probably one of the reasons I'm up here today. Francis Sheffield made me memorize those lines. And I butchered them today. I could have done a little bit better job, but she made me memorize a bunch of poetry. And I still remember some of it. they're just some things, the old memory, they stay with you. You can remember those. But if, Francis, wherever you are, you can hear me. And I feel that in that other spiritual world, they have ears we don't have. Thank you. I remembered after 60 years. Now, the story of this tetralogy begins with Land Where My Fathers Died. And there's another Francis that figures in that story and how that came about. Sandy and I were having dinner one night on our porch with Evans Harrington and his wife Betty, and a lady named Frances Patterson made that possible. And Evans was telling the story of a Confederado, and y'all have heard this before, but I delight in telling it again if you'll allow me. Of a Confederado who felt like he had, the Confederados were people when the Civil War ended, they went to foreign countries and they established their own little communities in those countries. Some went to China, some went to Argentina, some went to Brazil, a bunch went to Mexico. And Evans is telling the story of this guy that he does his research, and this is a true story. And he's looking for his long-lost Confederado kin in Brazil. And he was able to track it down to this small village near Sao Paulo, and to the house, and he goes. And he tells her in English who he is, and she swings the door open and says, "Well, why didn't you say so? Y'all come on in." So the accent was there, still there after all those years. I'm sitting there listening to Evans tell that story, and I'm thinking, there's a novel in here somewhere. So I started to work on it. And I don't want to tell too much because I want you to go buy the book if you hadn't read it. And you can, we've got them here today. Has them for you. But at the beginning of the story, a young man is released from prison. He's 24 years old, and he has nothing left. His parents have been killed in an auto crash. He goes to the plantation where they worked, and he finds these old letters written by his great-great-great-grandmother. And the letters are interspersed in the narrative here of the book. And so he goes in search of his Confederado kin. And it's kind of a Picard-esque story, Huck Finn and those type of characters, because it's an adventure. But he eventually comes to a place where he discovers or finds his great-great-aunt. And I want to read this to you. And as I go through this, I'm going to read how much time I got.
You got at least 45, 50 minutes.
Oh, I can do a lot of damage in 10 minutes. So I'm going to read. I've read this before, but I really enjoy reading this. And I want to apologize ahead of time because I get emotional when I read some of the things that I've written. And Peggy, you know, when you're writing, your soul's poured out on that page.
I cried.
Well, I wept after I wrote this, and I still choke up a little bit when I'm reading it because it still had that impact on me. So anyway, he comes to this hacienda in Mexico where he thinks his kin is, and he's ushered into her den, and he said, "Read the letters first, then read this," he said, handing her the paper from the registro, "and it'll explain why I'm here." She took the letters, adjusting herself as if she were missing her bifocals, and read. He watched the pale hazel eyes move slowly down each page, watched them widen and the pupils grow larger, and her mouth open and drop further open, and the wrinkles spread out over the amazed face until she was finished, and her hands and the papers in them collapsed in her lap. "Well, I'll declare," she said, "if that don't beat all." The accent was there, along with the idiom, the homegrown phraseology, passed down through the generations of his parents and theirs before them, and further back still, and all of it voiced once more, an echo blown down the canyon of years, and he trembled at its sound and smiled And she took out the towel and wiped his face, brushed away the tears that came unhurried down his bruised cheeks. Well, the last of that book sets us up for the next one, which is Inherit the Land. Oh, I got to tell you this. When this book was published in 2002, my publisher went bankrupt. And it was doing really well. It was about the same time that a guy named John Grisham's first book, his publisher went bankrupt. But you know the rest of that story. So anyway, it died. I mean, the book just didn't go anywhere. It sold well. It did well. It won some awards. But then it just didn't go anywhere after that. That reminds me, I need to turn my phone off. So it sat on the shelf for a long time, but I immediately, because it was doing so well at the time, I started writing Inherit the Land and started writing The Will because they were sequels to that book. And I was having fun because I was on a roll. I felt like I liked the voice in this book. I felt good about it, and I thought, let it continue. I thought it was pretty good stuff, but nobody else did. So they sat on the shelf for a long time. My current publisher at Black Rose Writing, I just sent him an email one day, and I said, how would you consider republishing a book that did quite well, and I've got sequels to it? And his email back to me was, Joe Edd, you've been holding out on me. Absolutely, he was willing to publish it. And so that's how we have The Will and Inherit the Land. And then The Prison came 20 years later. I'm working in a prison. At age 75, I applied for a job as a prison psychologist, and I got the job down at Tallahatchie County Corrections Facility, right next to Sunflower County, where the action in this novel takes place. And I was sitting there one day in my office, and I was wondering, this might be a sequel to Land Where My Fathers Died. So I resurrected Jo Shelby Ferguson, and he got a different name now. His daughter didn't want him to be called Jo Shelby because that was for Southern generals, and they weren't in vogue right at that time, so they decided to call him Shelby Ferguson. He becomes an amateur sleuth and solves some problems, but I'll go into that later. But I wanted to give you a little idea of the history of what this goes through, and Peggy knows writing is hard work. It's hard for me to get up, and I try to get up at 4 in the morning and write for a couple of hours, and then I go back and take a nap. I think about this story in the scriptures of Peter, Jesus, and the disciples. It's only told in 2 places, in Luke and in the Gospel of John. They've been out fishing all night. We've toiled all night. They've caught nothing. And Jesus, standing on the shore, says, go back out. And he's talking 100 yards. Row him back out 100 yards. And do it again, but this time throw the net on the right side. Y'all know that story? And they catch a lot of fish. But it's hard, folks, getting up some mornings and going to the same place, the same computer, the same boat, the same net, and doing it one more time. Because if you've got writer's block, you wonder, why am I doing this? But if you keep with it, there's a breakthrough, and the light shines, and you're able to move forward. It's tedious, and there's this saying that the devil is in the details. In art, the devil is not in the details. Heaven is in the details, because it's in the details that creates wonderful art. Whether it's Michelangelo, whether it's Picasso, whether it's Faulkner, it's the details that make it come alive for you. So anyway, the last page here, as I try to move along. It was not yet dawn, a faint blush of light outlining the mountains. He pushed himself up from the bed and pulled on his boots. He turned on the light and found a broken pencil and piece of paper in a drawer in the nightstand beside the bed. The note would be brief. Dear Senor Mancato, I don't know how you're going to take this because I ain't much good at saying goodbyes, but this'll have to do. You are a fine, brave woman and have already helped me more than any words I know could say. I would like very much to stay and help you, but there's something just not right about it all. I've got a home, and it's not here, but back where I came from, and there's somebody still there waiting for me. You helped me see that, too. I'm much obliged for your kindness and hospitality. I will be back to see you someday. The will. You can count on that. The air was cool as he slipped quietly through the arched gateway in the violet dawn and headed up the ruined road he felt he knew by heart. At the top of the ridge, he stopped and looked back once more at La Hacienda Tierra del Puente and thought about its name, Land of the Bridge, and he smiled. He had no money, but there was a gun dealer in Cuernavaca that would buy his gun. He knew, too, the way home and how to get there, and that people along the way would help him, and that was enough. Inherit the Land starts out Jo Shelby coming home. Flat and endless, the land swept by, dark and freshly plowed, and sweet-smelling, broken now and then by occasional splash of redbud, the first signs of Delta spring, that world he'd left behind, now materializing in his vision. The unchanging horizon, straight as a thread pulled tight. Distant solitary trees, the unpainted ramshackle houses along the highway and the big white columned ones afar off, and the colored people who worked both worlds treading the dusty roads between them. The cotton gins and church steeples, anchors that somehow held it all in place. He began figuring out how long it had been, surely years. But 6 months was all he could total on his fingers. He asked the man he'd hitched the ride with the date, and the man told him Saturday, March 12, year of our Lord, 1955, and asked why he needed to know. Just wasn't sure if it was yesterday or yesteryear, Jo Shelby said. The man cast him a puzzled glance and looked back at the highway. He was a large, burly man, wore a Western-style hat and had a huge mole on the side of his nose. You lost or something? The man said. Nope, found. They rode on. Jo Shelby could feel the man sizing him up in the silence. Been away a while, huh? Yep, you might say that. Seems like more than a while, though. Down south? Pretty much. The coast? Mexico. Mexico? What the hell you been in Mexico for? That's where I got found. It's a long story. The Delta at dawn. How many of you were raised in the Delta or been in the Delta? I was there 2 years as the associate pastor of the Drew Methodist Church, and I was also at Delta State University, and that was where my writing really took off. Something about the Delta, you know, it's a mystique or something. The Delta at dawn. There was nothing like it anywhere. First flush of light on a horizon, straight as if God had laid down a ruler and drawn it. First shaft shooting upward from behind it like a bomb going off on the other side of the world, firing the clouds pink and yellow and orange until the whole eastern sky seemed one huge bonfire. Then that first cusp of brilliant light, old as time, bright as a welder's arc. bulging into the fading dark, its rays streaking across the flatness, and you seeing them before anybody else in the world, before they struck beaches or ocean waves or touched the tops of the great mountains, because there was nothing in between to stop them as they raced that straight and true across the earth, that pure and unobstructed and undefiled. The Delta at dawn. That ring any bells? Folks, that's later. We'll start over again. Time was when time was something he didn't count. When it was one long stretch of days and nights running together and running nowhere, all one circular process without division or demarcation, simply there, spinning stuck in one place like a period, not laid out like a sentence, though that's what they called what he was doing. He was serving time, and that was his sentence, but he lived in the no time, in the there-ness, not knowing or caring when and where he was in it, because when and where were words long gone. The only word that mattered was there. Then he got out and was still not counting, because he'd been in prison so long his mind had forgotten how, or been worn down to just breathing second to second, or just didn't care because there was nothing to get out for. Then she said she loved him. Then not said it. And he began counting again the hours, days she didn't come home. That's Athen, his girlfriend from the land where my fathers died, and she becomes a major part of this story. All right, this is the end of Inherit the Land. There may be some names in here that you're familiar with, because I like to use names of people that helped me along the way. He dreamed, and in his dream felt the strength of the horse beneath him, its compact, stout flanks heaving against his legs, the smooth rhythm and roll of the ride, the furrowed ground sliding beneath him, the crisp night air against his face, the full moon rising, and the hoofbeats of another rider coming up fast behind him. Then the night suddenly soundless and still, and it was gone, his mind struggling in the darkness to bring it back. But all he saw when he opened his eyes was a sign on the small station that said Indianola. And he moaned he was no further along down the road. The bus door swung open, and the driver departed. Jo Shelby closed his eyes again, hoping to catch the dream and bring it back, ride it as long as he could, when a voice said, "Mind if I sit here?" He opened his eyes, blinked several times as if the batting of his lids might clear his vision and tell him which world he was in. "What?" he said, his eyes still dazed. "I said, do you mind if I sit here?" she said. The young lady was wearing sunglasses, a plain white T-shirt, and blue jeans, hair in a ponytail, and at first he didn't recognize her. "Athen." She removed her sunglasses. "Athen, what the—" She reached over and placed a finger on his lips. "Thought it might prove interesting, us heading in the same direction for once. Besides, I couldn't let you go traipsing off to Mexico by yourself, where some senorita might grab you. Now, could I?" She winked and slapped his knee playfully. He swallowed hard. The bus began pulling away, visible through the adjacent window. Mr. Bow and Miss Floy. You know that name? Standing beside their car, smiling and waving grandly. He waved back to them. "Well, if this doesn't beat all," he said, then leaned over and kissed her. She put a hand over his and squeezed. He squeezed back and looked through the window at the land, its neatly aligned rows passing swiftly by, at the stationary horizon that seemed to go nowhere, which was the Delta, all right. and he was glad they were on a bus going somewhere in the same direction, at least for the time being. Now, Jo Shelby, in land where my father's died, meets a young senorita in Mexico City. And they have kind of a relationship. It's very above board. But you can imagine what's going through his mind right now. They're going back down there to try to, by the way, the judge in Inherit the Land, there's a trial. And there's something, I don't have the legal mind, Neil, maybe you can tell me, but something, there's something on the will, there's a, well, no, but there's something wrong with the will because the way Athens' parents got this house, it used to be Jo Shelby and his family's house, and they got it passed down to him from a card game in the 1880s. And there's a blemish on the will. It's another word for it. But anyway, they have a long trial about it, and the judge decides that it can be solved if Jo Shelby can find the will, which is in a haystack in Mexico. I mean, almost literally. And so Jo Shelby, during the trial, Athens is on the witness stand, and he's serving as his own attorney. So he is cross-examining his sweetheart. I'm not going to tell y'all the rest. The book's up here if you want to get one. So, y'all, bear with me. When you write these books, you sometimes just can't keep up with them. Remember which ones are which. I do not use much profanity, very little, in my writing. I feel that it shows a lack of vocabulary. I feel that it's overused. If I'm reading a book and I'm in a lot of profanity, I just have to quit. To me, I'm not getting the artistry here. So I use it very sparingly, but when I use it, it has to be appropriate. It has to be at the point where it says something and has, hopefully, a little bit of class to it. So I'm going to shoulder on here. I'm realizing the crowd that I'm with. Y'all are conservative. I'm pretty conservative too, but bear with me. And forgive me if you're offended. The trip to Mexico City took 5 hours. Sandy is sitting over there wondering what I'm going to say. It'll be all right. The trip to Mexico City took 5 hours. The lady at the ticket booth had told them. Athens had insisted on paying for her ticket as she had most everything else along the way. She sold her sports car and gathered what savings she had from the same Mississippi bank where if her father hadn't cut her off completely her inheritance, the land was in hock. That was another problem he'd have to deal with if he found the colonel's will, saying it belonged to his family to begin with and not to hers. He remembered something about a Roman general who crossed a river, and when he did, there was no going back. He couldn't remember the name of the river, but the general's name was Caesar, and he figured Athens was head to toe with him. He thought, too, of his last venture into the country, of the loneliness of that solitary journey, and how often he manufactured her presence in his thoughts and dreams, and how her sitting beside him now almost made that agony an afterthought as the bus left the city and began its climb into the high Sierras. He wondered, too, how long the feeling would last, if she might backtrack and try to recross that river and find that teaching job after she met Carmen, because when she met Carmen, she was going to shit. And I might too, he said. Both of them were very attractive ladies. It was a word he knew and had heard before, but in a different language. In his tongue, it had to do with planning, but in theirs, it meant to create or to make. A word so essential that without it, their language, any language, would collapse into a fragmented, incoherent babble. In the time of his forefathers, it was a word that meant wealth and ownership and privilege. It was a word that meant poverty and inequality and disenfranchisement. It was a word that gave to few and took from most, a word hailed as the savior of the country, the one entity above all others that created work and livelihood for its people. Yet a word defamed as the villain of that same history, the residue of dominion and viceroyalty. It was a word that made the country, pulled its vast and sprawling diversity together, then caused it to be unmade and made over, much as its cousin word plantation had in his own country, which was the reason he was there. The word was hacienda. How am I doing? Okay, I'm getting there. I'm still in the wheel, and Athens is down in Mexico with him, and I'm telling y'all the sparks are flying. When Athens saw Carmen, she was, well, I didn't pick that part to read. There wasn't any profanity in it. She just was absolutely floored that Jo Shelby didn't tell her about Carmen, who was the lady in Mexico where he stayed 2 weeks, and she didn't know about that until they got together. And Carmen spilled the beans. The morning was still early as he left the outskirts of the city, the sun not yet visible above the eastern Sierras, but the sky behind them glowing orange with the promise of its approach. When its first bright beam would crest the peaks and sear the layered mists in the valleys and throw a clean sheet of bronze across the land, and the long daybreak mountain shade would stop and begin withdrawing. Between intermittent trees and buildings, he glimpsed Popocatépetl, the shuttered visual effect of the conical stack and its horizontal stream of vapor, that of a trail of smoke dragged across the sky by a train, the sleeping lady in tow. He thought again of the legend of the trafficked lovers, how closely it mirrored his life, how some tales may be carved in stone for a reason. One glimmer of hope, even if born of wishful thinking, he did glean and decipher from the mythical tableau. The train was going his way. Epilogue. Jo Shelby's older in this epilogue, and I decided I had to read this. Granddaddy, tell us how you and Grandmama met. The 12-year-old boy and his sister, 2 years younger, were sitting on the rug in front of the fireplace, sifting through some old photographs they had found in the attic. They had round brown faces and black hair and dark black eyes. Jo Shelby grunted and pushed himself up from the large leather chair where he'd been napping. His wife sat next to him in the chair of similar size and design. She was reading and looked up at the question, and they both winked at each other. He crossed the large room to a window and looked out at the land prostrate and depthless, at the cotton running white and gauzy all the way to the horizon, like an inverted sky with the clouds on bottom. We met out there, Calvin, he said. Here? The girl said. That's right, Caroline, her grandmother said. When was it? Caroline said. Athens laid her book on her lap and thought, I can't think of a time. We just grew up together. Gosh, Calvin said, Mom and Daddy sure didn't grow up together. Daddy met her in Mexico on a church trip. Athens smiled. It was a mission up from our church, she said. Your granddaddy paid for it. He'd been there before and knew a man who worked there. That's when you went to Mexico, Granddaddy, wasn't it? Jo Shelby turned from the window and nodded. Hanging on the wall beside him, encased in a shadow box, was a pistol. Y'all, this pistol is of mythical proportions throughout this book. "And that gun, Granddaddy, tell us about the gun," his grandson said, his dark eyes flashing. His grandmother picked up her book again and glanced at him over the top. "That's a long story, Calvin. Longer than this book I'm reading. Longer than any book you'll ever read." "That's pretty long," he said. "I know," she said, "it's that long." And she looked up and smiled at Jo Shelby, still standing in front of the window, and he looked at her and smiled. Calvin is his grandson, who becomes a Methodist preacher and is convicted of a murder he didn't commit, and he's in a prison. In the prison I was telling you about earlier, though I had to change the name of it and change some other things around. But towards the end of the prison, Jo Shelby asked Calvin if he's thought about what he's going to do now that he's out of prison. And Cal gave no response, as though his mind was elsewhere. "Have you thought about what you might do once you're exonerated?" Shell attempted. After a long delay in answering, Cal said, "I've thought about it. Everything's been swirling around in my mind like a merry-go-round I need to get off, but can't." "You can when it stops," Shell said, "and it will eventually stop. Time is on your side." "Time," Cal sighed with a single nod, then uttered the word again and nodded again. "Time is what I was serving. Now that I'm out, I still feel like I'm serving it." "We're all serving time, son," Shell said. "If you're living, you're serving time. Time is God's other name. No way to get around that big clock." Cal looked at him in. "That should be my line. I'm the preacher." "Glad you still feel that way. You kept the faith. You survived." A pause, Cal thinking. Then, "I don't think I survived because I kept the faith, whatever that means. Sounds like protective custody, that if you hang on to it long enough, God will eventually bail you out. I survived because..." He sat there, molars grinding, jaw muscles rippling, rolling his hand as if the movement spun the rest of the thought. Shell sensed him struggling. "What you're trying to tell me, Cal, is that faith doesn't sit on its haunches and wait. It has legs." "Granddad, you're amazing," Cal said, looking at him with bright eyes. And then the final lines of the book, in the aftermath, I've called it here. "The levee along the Mississippi River still rivals the Great Wall of China. The levee road continues to serve as a travel option for the adventurous who want to drive on it from Illinois to Louisiana. The Mississippi Delta is as flat and endless as ever, and will always be the Delta. The prison is everywhere." Thank you all for having me today. Are there any questions?
I'm familiar with the term the Confederata. So when you conducted your research, I knew after the war there were some groups of people that went to those various places that you talked about, but I wasn't aware there were like actually villages and they were a distinct population and a distinct group. Can you speak to that?
Well, the General Jo Shelby was the Southern General of the West. And he's the one that took his men when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and they got word of it. They went into Mexico. Mexico then, Maximilian was the emperor, and they were going to convince Maximilian to give them some land. Well, he did. I'm going to cut a lot of stuff out. They had a lot of incidents along the way, fighting Indians and banditos and desperados, et cetera, et cetera. But they get up. Maximilian gives them some property close to Juarez. Is it Juarez? George, what's the city on the coast in Mexico, halfway up?
On the East Coast?
Yes.
Veracruz.
Veracruz. Thank you very much. It was not far from Veracruz, and they called it Carlotta because that was the name of Maximilian's wife. And they lived there for a couple of years. They planted cotton. They planted butter beans and black-eyed peas, and because they brought all that stuff with them. And then, blowing out of the north comes this guy, Benito Juarez. Carlotta was no more. They were dispersed. I mean, their luggage, their furniture was thrown into the streets. They got out just in time. And one of the main characters in the group, who wrote the woman who wrote the letter, she and her husband, he was a colonel, fictitiously, they went north of Veracruz, north of Carlotta, and they found a hacienda, fictional hacienda, out from Cuernavaca. I'm fond of Cuernavaca because, Peggy, you've been on mission trips with us to those places, hadn't you? Yeah. And so I was doing a lot of research when I was on some of those trips. I almost feel guilty about it, but anyway, it was a nice experience. Does that help? Now in Brazil, there was a community near Sao Paulo. And I don't know about China, but I know some went to China. A lot of these Confederados found their way back into the country and were able to get through the Lincoln's security guards. In fact, Jo Shelby became the president of the University of Missouri. And some others had people of distinction. One was a senator from Mississippi, whose name I can't recall right now. Does that help? They came home. Most of them did.
Joe, would you mind if I tell the audience something about you? It's good.
By all means.
By all means. As you know, I'm Peggy Webb, and I've been writing professionally for 4 years, almost 100 novels I've written in my career. And in that time, I have read hundreds of thousands of pages. And I just want to say about Edd Morris that he is one of the very few writers writing today, and even in the past, who has this ability to create amazing lyrical language. He is an expert at that. And he's a treasure. He's a treasure. So many people judge us, Edd, by whether we are sitting on the New York Times list or this, that, or the other. Great commercial success in novels does not always mean the best writer. Let me tell you that. There stands one of the best writers in America today, and it's my privilege to be your friend, Edd, and to have been on this amazing journey we've had, sort of parallel together and compare notes. I've loved every moment of it. Great job.
Thank you.
Well, you're here.
Thank you. I think the highest compliment I've ever been paid was when you wrote somewhere, reading Edd Morris is like reading poetry.
That's true. That's true. Pat Conroy had that sort of lyricism.
Yeah.
But so few writers do it. I've been accused of having it too.
Well, you do. I got she doesn't like me talking about her, but Sandy was my editor.
Yeah.
She's a former English teacher. And Stephen King, in his book on writing, said to be a successful writer, you need to stay healthy and stay married. And I wanted to add something to that and marry a former English teacher, because Sandy has edited all of this, and if there are any errors in here, it's because the publisher made them. And she takes no prisoners. We've had some.
Well, I'm not married, but I did teach writing at Mississippi State, so I think that counts.
It does. I think I'm through.
Any other questions?
Anybody else want to ask a quick question?
And we have books over here.
Yeah. So if you, okay, thank you very much.
Very much.